This is the oldest picture I have of Robert Crookston. Robert is 90 years old. He is there with his daughter, Mary Ann Farmer, and his granddaughter, Virginia. So both Mary Ann and Virginia are living with Robert at this time. The Mary Ann only had 3 children. 2 children died at birth, and so Virginia was her only child to live to adulthood. And although she lived a very long life, she never did marry. So this is the last of the line of Mary Ann Farmer. She was the 10th child of Robert Crookston, and she was the only girl that Robert and Ann had. Aunt Mary, or Mary, married Thomas Farmer, and in 1899 they moved to Star Valley. We're going to talk I want to go through the different children of Robert and Ann. And so probably the first two I'm going to start with is George Crookston and James Crookston. So James Crookston was born just after they arrived in Salt Lake City. He died as an infant or as a toddler. And George Crookston was their oldest child. Karen Hall is their adopted child, but George Crookston was their oldest child. And when they were living in Moroni, they had friends that had joined the church, or people from the old country, from Scotland, that came and joined the church and came to Utah. And so they had them stay at their home, but there was not enough room for all of them to fit into this one room home. And so George Crookston stayed out and slept on the wheat in the wheat bin. And the wheat was damp, and so he caught pneumonia and died. That was a really hard thing for Ann and Robert, particularly for Ann. And I want to go through each one of the children. Although I came from David, I really didn't know much about the other children, and they had quite a variety of where they lived and what they did, and they had a lot of interaction. So the first one I'd like to talk about is John Crookston. So John Crookston, he married Elizabeth Prater Mong. So
Elizabeth Prater was Peter Mong's third plural wife. He died in April of 1871 while Elizabeth was still young. She was left as a widow at the age of 24 years with just 3 small children. Frances Mary, age 3, Heber Chase was a year and a half, and Ada was just 7 weeks old. Just 4 months after that, the baby died of whooping cough. Elizabeth did marry again shortly after that, and she married with another plural marriage, and that didn't work, and she was into that less than 1 year. When Heber Chase was 7 years old, John married Elizabeth, and to them was born 8 more children. The family moved to Cass Junction, and Cass Junction was the place where the railroad was a major stopping point, and so many of the people that passed through there would stop and see the Crookstons.
William, known as Bill, when he was 21, he went to work in the mines. He worked in Eureka, Mercer, and Stockton. While he was in Mercer, he met Agnes McKellar, and she was born and reared in Tooele, but she came from Scottish parents, and they got married in 1873. Bill got established in Logan, but was called up by the church to go down to Arizona. So he went down to Arizona with his wife. Also, his brother Frank went down there with him. They settled in a place called Pima. It was extremely hard there. The saints there were basically kicked out because it was ruled as Indian land, and so they could not take the land. Later it was decided that it wasn't Indian land, and that's when they asked Will to go down there. So Will and Frank were down there, and while they're down there, there was still bad relation with the Indians. The Indians were so bad that pioneers had to build a stockade to which the women and children would run when the Indians were seen. The men tried to defend themselves, but they were outnumbered. And he told of 1 year when they planted corn so they could feed their animals as well as themselves. And when the corn was ripe, the Indians came and picked all the corn, and they just couldn't do much. And it found out later that they weren't supposed to be down there. So after being down there 6 years, William and his wife was getting ill too. They went back, and so did Frank, and his wife died, stopping visiting her family in Tooele. And so after Agnes passed away, William had no way of taking care of his 3 children. So at the funeral, Uncle Nick and David, so his brother Nick and David, came up to the funeral and brought back his 3 children, and his 3 children were now raised by Robert and Ann, and also Nicholas and his wife. While William he went up to Montana and he worked the mines. So he worked the mines until then, and it was much later before he was ever reunited with his children. Okay. Two of the other children, just mentioned, Frank went with William down to Arizona, but Ezra and Frank never married. And in the very early 1900s, they went up to work in Yellowstone, and they homesteaded property in Montana, just at West Yellowstone. And up there, at the time, Yellowstone had become quite a tourist destination. However, the train would come up through the Montana side and stop about 4 or 5 miles from Yellowstone. And so there was a livery station there, and they would send out stagecoaches to go pick up the pioneers, or pick up the tourists to bring them into Yellowstone. So Frank he drove stagecoaches for many, many years. And then Ezra, he was the one that set up all the stagecoaches with their horses. He worked the livery station, and they did that until the automobiles became very popular, and then there was no need for stagecoach. They had the automobiles, and so at that time, Ezra continued working for Yellowstone Park, and Frank went and would live off the land. At that point, Frank and Ezra knew that their brother Nick really liked to show off things at parades and that, and so they suggested they were selling off all these stagecoaches, and these are really nice large stagecoaches that they would pick people up with. And so Nick sent money up there, they bought it, and then Nick was going to come up there and get it, but with him going on a mission and various other things, he didn't quite get up there, but still had it up there. Well, anyway, it got to the point where Frank and Ezra were living there for a very long time, and 20 years, and Frank has a heart attack, and so Ezra calls Nicholas, his brother Nicholas, and says, "Hey," and it's the middle of winter, "Hey, Frank's not doing very well, just had a heart attack." And they came to the conclusion that Nicholas would come and get him, and so Nicholas was in his late 60s, and his family was a little concerned about him traveling up there, but he did anyway. So he went up there as far as he could on the train, and I believe it was about the last 35 miles. There was no way of getting there except by dog sled, and so he hired a guy that had some dogs, and they dog sled in there, and they got Frank. And while he was up there, he says, I had to check in on my stagecoach. And when he went over there, he talked to the owner of the store, and the store guy goes, "I'm sorry, Frank and Ezra had such a huge bill at the general store here that they gave the stagecoach to pay off their bill." So Nicholas was not too happy they lost his stagecoach. Anyway, he came back. His family believed the way Nicholas was, and with Frank's condition, that Nicholas probably went on foot while Frank went with the dog sled with the other person that did this dog sled. Frank came back, and he lived with Mary Ann for about 3 years, and then he passed away. Ezra stayed up there a little bit longer, and the ranch the property they had became a dude ranch, and Ezra got it all set up there until his health was bad. And then he came back. I think Nicholas' son Oscar went and got him, and they picked up Ezra, brought him back. He stayed with Mary Ann until just before Mary Ann passed away. Mary Ann and Ezra were pretty close in the family, age-wise in the family. And then Ezra spent the rest of the time with Emma. And I'll probably talk about Emma a little bit later. Okay, so the next one after that is, David and Nicholas is pretty interesting in that they both did many things together. All the brothers lived in Logan, even after they got married for a little while. And we all know that Nicholas was a sheriff and a bishop up there, but he also had joined. Here's Nicholas in his uniform for the volunteer fire department. Number one is because it's the first fire department in the Logan, and David also belonged to it. The other thing that's interesting is Nick became a sheriff, but David also was a police officer for Logan while he was there, and then later became a marshal and I think a deputy in Hiram. And they both became fish and game wardens. And so they had a lot of the same similar things, and I take it that David and Nick probably had a lot of interaction. So during the late 1890s, when there was a black smallpox epidemic there, and the black smallpox was a particular type of smallpox where I believe it was around 85% of the people that got it all died. And so Nick, being the sheriff, had to deal with this. And so Nick and David would take people up that had black smallpox. They had a place where they put them in some shacks to live in. And Robert, their father, who said he had smallpox before, felt that he could, be a little bit immune. And so he would help get food to them. And so they did that for a small while, and most of the people died. And once they got to a point that they believed they were not sick anymore, they would burn all their clothes. They burned the shacks. They burned everything that was around them, and allowed them to go back to their family. One of the things, Nick as a sheriff, he had to deal a lot with people being drunk, and he also had to deal a lot when the feds would come in and want to round up the polygamists. And so Nick, when he knew the feds were coming for plural marriage raid, he would tell David, his brother, and David had a very fast cart and horse, and he would go out and go to Hiram and Wellsville and Paradise to spread the word out for them all to find their little hiding spots, which could be under the floor, little caves they made, but there's a lot of places. And so Nick was always giving forewarning that, hey, we're coming and rounding them up. But anyway, that was part of the things that happened there. So this is kind of a funny story of Nick, and I'm not going to spend much time. I mean, Robert Burns is really interesting to talk about, but since this is the Robert Burns reunion, I think most people know about him. Anyway, Nick's daughter, Hilda Edna, wrote, "For years it was Nick Crookston's responsibility to wake up the city of Logan on the 4th of July. He set off dynamite in a gravel pit on Temple Hill above the town, and I'm sure the blasts were heard miles away. As might be expected, he also had to furnish the dynamite, and his source was in Richmond, about 15 miles away. I will never forget when he took me with him in a two-wheeled cart driving old Jimmy. I was required to ride backwards on the way home. He said, 'Watch out for everyone, or for anyone coming at us. If we get hit, we'll be blown sky high.' You can believe me, I was so scared at the thought that I kept a constant lookout, and you can be assured that was the last time I ever went on such a ride." And so Nick was quite the character, was very involved in it. He had some oxen, and he would take them for show, and seemed like he was always in the main ones in the parade, and being sheriff, I'm sure that happened.